I made a live just now, but I think it may not upload, and I wanted to be teachable with this. So what I can appreciate, if there's anything worse than if there's anything worse than a conspiracy theory, is like somebody that's like on a platform having problems with the platform, trying to get past the platform while using the platform. So I never thought I'd see the day. There's some things you thought you'd never see in life, right? I never thought I'd actually see the day where I'd be uploading a YouTube video, a video at all on YouTube, and being one to talk about the algorithm, like, yeah, man, they're playing with my algorithm, man, they're playing with my subscribers, stuff like that. I never actually thought in this life, not that I never actually thought at any point prior to like a year ago, and even the last year a lot, but even prior to a year ago when I started doing YouTube, I never thought there would actually come a day where I'd be having a YouTube channel and that I'd be the one that's like, hey man, this is the thing about the algorithm, this and that, support your boy, this and that, because they're doing this and that. But what I can appreciate is that, and this is a little bit teachable, is that the YouTube platform, it'll buffer and it'll interrupt your feed if you're too specific with referencing someone or something. As it's probably there's probably a legal component to that. If you call out a person and their name, which is technically a business, because each person contracts business daily. You can't, isn't in the United States, you can't actually exist in the United States is so corporate that you cannot exist upon the United States without transacting business, without being your own form of business. Like some people be like, start your LLC and stuff like that, but you're actually your own. Like I don't know if you would say LLC or what the most equivalent analogy would be, but you're your own form of business and also independent contractor, whether or not you're employed or not, whether or not you're 1099 or not, or anything. Because a lot of the things you do, they amount to contracts, and it's a contracted business. Like to make a video like from a library, like like, or to frequent somewhere public, you're actually being there. You're only tolerated to be there so much as you're in good standing there, and also you're being able to be in good standing and then transacting while standing there, and then further sustaining good standing, or conceding good standing. It has to do with your comportment and your transacting, your statements, and like where you would position your body and your effects, and what you do with your body and your effects and your statements. That's probably a lot of who and what you are, is your body, your effects, and your statements, such that you can get blasted out of somewhere. You can almost already be inappropriate. You can almost be arrested to walk up somewhere with too many bags. If you walk somewhere with bags and it's unsightly, you could probably be prompted to leave somewhere, or you could soon be engaged, such as it would quickly, rapidly escalate to you being prompted to bounce out of somewhere because you would be carrying too many bags. Not even a lot of bags, but just one too many bags, right? So I have like I'll carry a backpack and a front loaded backpack, like a kind of like a rucksack. Then that's one thing, right? You could say that's actually better for a person, because like you're having a lot better of posture and strength if you were to actually walk weight bearing more so, because then when you're not weight bearing, you're like free as a bird. So it's like almost like ankle weights for basketball players, just a chest weight for life. So there's nothing wrong with two backpacks in itself. It doesn't necessarily look entirely crazy. But if you were to have two backpacks in a bag of any kind, almost any size, that's one too many there, buddy. I'm not enough to, I can't float you that one. So you can get in a lot of trouble that you would have one too many things, or even one thing that wouldn't be appropriate. There's nothing wrong with the bag. It's not illegal to walk outside with the bag, but it can be unsightly. That can be actually affect the bottom line of someone's business. Because, ooh, did you see they're now having people with bags somewhere at the library? Did you see they had some person with a bag at the library? So I'm just saying, wherever we go, your effects, that probably impact your accoutrements, which is like, I think your tire, your garb, your wardrobe. I think your wardrobe is your accoutrements, which can be your clothing, your tire, and also your equipment. All that can be your accoutrements and your wardrobe. Your clothing, that's part of camouflage and or uniform, and or disguise. So that's part of a war chest, part of probably a wardrobe. And then but then that too, your tire can be like that, your garb would be like that, and then your accoutrement, I think, is all that. But if you have one too many, so if you're actually, I walk around with a guitar and also a bag that has also books about music. They didn't know there had been a Bible in there, but have books about music, things like that, that can be used to further be to better use the guitar, which is an instrument, but also a little bit of a grace. Sometimes a saving grace. Sometimes a means of accessing something. Sometimes a means of support. If you have no other means of support and you have the chops, you can support yourself with an instrument. In a time such as inflation is a time of war. So in a time of war, a guitar is actually an implement as effective, if not better, than a firearm, because a firearm can get you arrested. A firearm, one of the least creative thing a person can do is to employ a firearm. I'll be one to say it, unless you're artistic about it, unless you're passionate about it, unless you're so skilled. The highest skill is actually to withstand. The highest skill is the highest discipline is to withstand. So the best you could become at with a firearm, it would be to not use a firearm. To be so good with a firearm that you would not have to use it. Whether maybe to use, if you could use a firearm humorously, or like artistically, creatively, such as to not employ it and obtain an objective, that's actually the best use of a firearm. That's actually skill par excellence as to transcend the need for a firearm. But under normal circumstances, I think a firearm is about the least creative thing a person can do. So if you're on hard times and you had to get over, heaven forbid, with a firearm, like to intimidate someone with a firearm, or heaven forbid, victimize someone with a firearm, that's about the least creative thing you could do, and also the least effective thing you could do, even in a time of war. Because what's a firearm going to do? It's going to call attention to you. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. So you're going to get about as much flak back, round per round, round by round, round per round. In a time of war, you could potentially, sooner or later, directly or indirectly, get as much flak back for employing a firearm, if not more, sevenfold or more flak back for the firearm, the lesser of skill, or the greater of skill, which would be not to use a firearm, or use a firearm as a decoy, as a ruse. But then an actual instrument in a time of war such as inflation, the greatest victims in war are women and children. That's one thing that Hillary Clinton was spot on about. Hillary Clinton herself, I will support Hillary Clinton's statement that women and children suffer the most in a time of war. But not only women and children that you see, but women and children that you don't see, away from the battle and not yet here or hereafter. Women and children got it the worst in war. But then also, what war is. War is not guns and bombs in itself. That's actually the more superficial part of war, and also not the most costly and painful part of combat and conflict. Is not guns and bombs. Because heaven forbid, had it been a guns and bombs, that's gonna be horrible and traumatic. It's one thing enough to hear a round go off in real life, a real actual round that means business. But I can only imagine what it feel like to hear a bomb go off. Someone was talking about that the other day. Like, they're like, yeah, you can imagine fireworks out of season, but what about bombs out of season or in season? What would be worse than being a bomb or a firearm would be like collateral, friendly fire, POW, stuff like that, and also starvation, destitution, displacement, or being a refugee, having to flee, devastated infrastructure, devastated psyche, devastated people, devastated culture, nation, cycles of poverty, cycles of violence, cycles of trauma. That's more significant than guns and bombs in itself. But even so, in an actual in the war, what I'm saying, the real devastation of war and the real setting of war is the economics, because the economics set everything. You're not getting all the way onto, or all the way on past, or all the way on through, or all the way on as guns and bombs without the economic viability for that, and the actual setting and temperature would have to be the economics first. So I'm saying economic devastation is what war is. That comes probably from lack of cooperation on different levels, and like probably at different levels, hoarding of different things. Um, so I'm saying is that actually, now that we're in inflation, we're actually in a war is upon us. I don't mean to want to talk about wars, or rumors of war, or even sound the clarion of war. But actually, if you just simply appreciate the state of economics in the United States, is that it's actually now active war that we would have inflation. That's not new, because the incongruence of American society on an economic level, going way back, that constitute different degrees of war as Cold War. So the Cold War actually never stopped being the Cold War, not only aimed against and understood against any particular nation, but actually just the state of inequity in the United States. That's actually different degrees of war, and it's wars yet profitable. War aimed without and within. So someone recently pointed out that when you had the war on drugs, I think the war on drugs actually took place prior to, or concurrent with, the appearance of crack cocaine in the 1980s. But part of the war on drugs, mind you, I'm not egregious to say mind you, but I would say, mind you, the part of war on drugs is also the prescription and the offloading of drugs onto vulnerable populations, not only ethnically identifiable, ethnic, socioeconomic, not only identifiable ethnic cohorts, swaths, contingents, groups, targets only, but also marginal affected people in terms of health, because health is yet an actual social demographic metric. When you think of demographics, you may think of like ethnicity and complexion, or maybe like creed or orientation. You might think of that, but part of that, as significant of that, is actually your medical status is like that. So just like you need civil rights to protect people, otherwise things will get egregious. You also need protection of privacy, like with things like HIPAA in healthcare, because medical case histories and the experiencing of medicine and the application of medicine to already vulnerable people, and sometimes people that are not savvy unto some of the sophistication of the baseball and the mechanics of both law, fair, legal, and also medicine, and also employment and income economics, how those all interchange and dovetail neatly and sometimes heinously. So you could say a doctor that's living on, we're moving on up to the east side, baby. I got my degree and now I got a better job in medicine, baby. The doctor might be the one who has the better end of the shaft of being railroaded by medicine and healthcare and pharma and insurance and stuff like that. However, they're not off the shaft. So there's probably some different. They're divulging their time, their resource, their effort, their bandwidth, and also it can be stressful to be in the vicinity. Just like sickness can rub off on people, states of mind can also affect people. So doctors aren't all the way out the woods, but they got the better viewpoint in the woods. But I'm saying that a medical status is part of, and one of the pivotal of demographics, and also from thereby target identifiable, malleable, manageable, profitable, alienable, targetable, social demographics and cohorts and constituents and people, such that medically affected people, people who can be identified easily medically and marginalized, can be victimized and are profit based, but also are collateral in war and casualties in war. Is the actual state of medical war on drugs is not limited to criminals and or criminals of traditionally targeted communities, but the war on drugs affects also and targets also medically marginal people, and that can actually even be people from within the status quo, because money is money, and the status quo is not a respecter of, even though the status quo exactly is a respecter of persons, contrary to the greater of persons, who is appreciated as great for not being a respecter of persons. The status quo actually functions as a respecter of persons, but in the application of its penalties, and also the application of its duties, which can be penalties also, and the confiscation of bounties, which is part of its duties and its penalties. The status quo is not a respecter of persons. Neither too is So when you say status quo, you could assume be referring to gentrification, arbitrary bias, in-group preference, nepotism, any level of stratification of the different arbitrary human casting and castigating systems upon that are proliferate in the West and probably dispense abroad. Now I appreciate that we may be in something called digitalism. I wouldn't be the first one to say that, but I appreciate digitalism as part of the legacy of all the actual suffering and sufferings, especially in the United States, and as brutal and arbitrary and exacting as any other one. Digitalism now. Before that, I think you had materialism, and materialism existed through many. You could say materialism had. You can maybe say that all. So digitalism, right? Digits refers to the fact that we use for our computing systems, and also our. Okay, we rolling, baby. We rolling, baby. So I'm saying these different iterations, right? So I'm saying that we may now. I appreciate now that we're in something called digitalism. Then before that, prominently, we were in materialism, circa at least like late '80s, early '90s was materialism proper. Before that, you may maybe let's see, maybe you had like different latter points of like industrialism, like wage slavery, you could say, the 60s, 70s, stuff like that. Then you had like sharecropping and Jim Crow prior to that. Then but through all that, and then you had like real industrialism before that. I'm a little bit loose with that. I don't mean to be heinous with that, and I'm a little bit going past the scope of what I can appreciate, because that's going before I was around, before the 80s and 90s. So I can speak better to the 80s and 90s and later from personal experience. But I know that you had different iterations of social stratification But they one is actually within the other in a latent or expressed form. So even if you go back prior to the proliferation of like what's called the World Wide Web and the personal computer, which was an epiphany, but it didn't actually get away from the actual functions and cycles of human castigation and stratification. It actually, at first, it impressed it, it baffled it, but it didn't all the way transcend it. And so that a lot of things, they come back like a boomerang. So the actual oppression and the inequity, it's actually stronger by all the things that would almost break it. Because if you almost break, it's kind of like in the Holy Bible, it says that if you actually were to clean something of like whatever would be a detriment, like in terms of spirit, that spirit will redouble sevenfold stronger, or it's seven different iterations if you were to clear something, but then like renege or backslide or re-invoke, re-invite something to something that had been cleaned. So if you kick people out of a party, then you clean up, then you bring it back, you might have a more of a party and harder to clean on your hands. But I think that's true with because a half measure is no measure because it makes it anything stronger. So we didn't get all the way out of nothing just because the personal computer came around. However, we can still be creative with it, so we can still do anything, include transcend with the personal computer. But I'm saying that the personal computer came into and was part of digitalism, but it was still prior to the personal computer, I think, because you still had a lot of sophisticated electronics before the personal computer proliferated. And I think they may have been similar, like in terms of ones and zeros, and or using mathematics at all, which is in our system the Hindu Arabic numeral system, which I got that reference from the algebra, pre-algebra and algebra for dummies by Mark, I think Ziccarelli, like one of the older iterations, like 2014 or so. Not the oldest, but one of the older iterations. He referenced that what we use for numbers is part of the Hindu Arabic numeral system. That might actually be a loose connotative statement, and that might actually be a little bit of a deflection of where and exactly how and who is to be credited with the actual application of mathematics based on a reference of our 10 digits, both the 10 digits of our carpal bones, the toes, which are phalanges, and also the tarsal bones, the feet, which are also phalanges, and may stem from the fact that we had been seafaring and going creatures. According to the channel Navajo Elder Teachings by the Dene people, or Dene Elder, we now populate something called the yellow world. So I've done videos about this in the past, saying that yellow is a very significant color. Among all the colors, yellow is very significant in what it will betray anywhere yellow is applied, and what can be appreciated by appreciating the color yellow. I appreciate you for appreciating me, Mr. Yellow. But then before that, it's appreciated by the Dene people. Is that we populate something called a blue world. So when you see like turquoise jewelry, like beautiful turquoise jewelry in the Southwest, it's beautiful, it's meaningful, it's speaking on that because it's meaningful and symbolic. Not only is it symbolic, but it's congruent with the experience that the symbology references. So the color blue speaks on a lot of levels, like in that turquoise color, but a person may not know what actually that is symbolic about that, and what that may speak to the conscious and subconscious. Is that according to the Dene teachings, is that we came from a blue world, was at least a second world that we had populated and come through, and that we're now in a was characterized as a yellow world. It's interesting. A lot of I would imagine that most. So what are we busy to do about all day long? We're busy to do about eating all day long. We're looking forward to eating. We're getting overeating. Maybe we're upset about something wasn't served right. But the main thing that we're preoccupied with and that we also enjoy in life is food, from the earliest ages to all the way through. I just had someone get upset with me today, elderly person, because I was practicing my singing chops around people that have been eating food. He's like, man, this is for eating, man. But he didn't know I was enjoying my coffee while I was singing. But to each their own. But also most of the things that we would consume, I bet they were fed a lot of corn. So we eat a lot of we eat a lot of cow beef. I'm not sure. So pork is called swine. I forget what cow is called. Like in the more, cow is like a bovine. I think the scientific term for the cow family, like your oxen, horses. I'm not sorry, oxes, cattle, buffalo, water buffalo. Those are, I think that's the bovine family, but I'm not sure. I'm forgetting what you call. So beef, but forgetting what you call beef, like would be synonymous with swine or pork for beef. But a lot of that, but also too pork also likely and chicken also likely are fed corn. I think there a lot of corn is dispersed into what they be fed. I imagine that like some kind of gruel or like some kind of like slop. Like I don't know if you'd have pig slop or like cow slop, but it's a lot to do about corn. I think like especially what would be like man made for the purposes of horticulture, and so thereby most of the things we do are from either eating those sources, and then those sources also they probably factor into a lot of what we do. Like sometimes it'd be I used to have like this encyclopedia set that my family purchased in the 90s, and one time I tried to read the whole damn thing. I actually got through the letter A. I read all the way through the letter A. There's two books for A. I got through A and a half of so I didn't make it all the way through double. I didn't make it through triple A, but I made it through A and a half of I didn't make it through AA, but I made it through A and a half of the encyclopedia from the 90s. And if you, I don't know if that was like a waste of time because you can't probably like recall all that, but you can appreciate actually how sophisticated things are made with going through the encyclopedia, and such that a lot of things are counterintuitive and also sophisticated for being counterintuitive, but also simple and sophisticated for being simple, and that too counterintuitive, such that I imagine that animal products are used and rendered in a lot of ways, and such as corn also. So corn may be actually the most significant color in this life, and I think that corn was a staple to the Native American people for a long time before contacting Europeans. And then you could say that some of our what the world is now, like what's viable in it, and then what's like imitated and replicated in the world over in terms of like freedom and liberty, and what's possible through the United States, how influential the United States is. That's possible and viable exactly because of some of the reciprocity, cooperation, and support of the Native American people, and their culture was largely based around corn. So you could say that the reality of America, thereby secondhand at least, inherited significant. With corn would have to be significant to the United States, and the United States is significant to the world over, especially in terms of having a standard of a dollar, so to speak, that has stabilized a lot of transactions the world over, maybe for better or worse, but also for better. I think sometimes the stability of the dollar is appreciated as a stabilizing thing, and that might have to do with how we're in inflation now, which is what I wanted to reference. But all that is that's the significance of the color yellow, but it's appreciated that we came through before that a blue world, and our like my hand there, the webbing between my hand and the digits, that's reminiscent of like a fin for a fish, and it may speak to our descended state from the ocean. And also we have reciprocity with creatures in the ocean because like especially the mammals of which, because like if you appreciate dolphins and whales, I think that dolphins and whales as mammals, like you have different vertebrae, right? So you have I forget how many vertebrae you have in total, but you have the cervical vertebrae, which is like your neck. You have which are the C vertebrae, like C1 through 7. Then you have the thoracic vertebrae. I think T1 through 12. That's like your torso, like all the way from your neck to your like your lower back. Then you have your lumbar vertebrae. I think that might be 5. Then you have your sacral vertebrae, which may still be fused together. So your sacrum is actually technically your vertebrae. Your pelvis is technically your vertebrae. And if you think about it, your pelvis is almost in the shape of a broader vertebrae. I just learned something right there while enunciating, and I was having a conversation with a brother in Spanish a couple days ago. He was heavy set. I saw him at a distance, and I just met him for the first time, and he was talking about lady problems. Like, yeah, man, I think that she had my baby, so he was just saying like some crazy stuff like about female problems, like for grown adult female problems. But then I was like, that guy looked a little bit heavy set. But then when I saw my face, he had this beautiful face. Like his face looked like that of if you can imagine like an adult star, an adult film star that was like a little bit gender fluid, but they had like just this like killer like face like that. That's how this man face looked like that. But he was talking in clear English, and he was so pissed that he was saying some beautiful stuff while he was pissed. I was like, man, that's straight verses right there. That's real poetry, man. You can keep all that. She loved me not, Rosa red, violets are blue. I need more of that stuff. But then he and I started talking in Spanish. He's like, wow, you really, and he could appreciate that I was learning Spanish while speaking Spanish, like because I had engaged the app Duolingo. If you engage Duolingo, it teaches you so much of vocabulary and all that. Sometimes when you're speaking based on the time you spent with that app, you can actually reach for words and begin to conceive words, understand words in conversation, and actually grow your chops while using the language based on your prior exposure to that app, even if it had been several months, or for me, actually a year or a year and a half or more since I've engaged it regularly. It's interesting how you can actually learn from your own mind. That's what he was appreciating. He's like, wow, I can see you learning I can see you learning while you're talking to me. He's like, man, if you got around like my friends like in the Southwest or Mexico, man, you'd be up and off to the races soon like that. But that's the deeper thing, is that actually we have more of knowledge in our mind than we typically think. And I actually was listening to my stylist. Someone was asking about my hair. I want to get back to that in the prior video to this that got interrupted. My stylist, I think she's Ghanaian. I was listening to my stylist. She made an accommodation for me recently where she got me in like a little bit later, past like I was there before she closed, but she finished my hair after like a little bit late hours because she has her own business like that at her own home. But I'm not sure if it's her home, but it's her own business that she controls the space. And she was talking to someone in Ghanaian, and like I was kind of like she was twisting my hair, and it get like, for me it's not painful now, but it's still a little bit, just a little bit intense, like when you twist your hair like that. But it's an acquired taste. It can learn to feel good when she twists your hair like that. But when she was doing that, and she was talking in Ghanaian, I could actually begin to understand a lot of what she was saying in Ghanaian, because you're that it's interesting. They say like the confusion of tongues, like in the Babel, and that all languages had been one. Sometimes if you listen to languages like that, especially languages that have been contacted by colonialism, even Ghanaian, like, so you have like you have Spanish, you have Spanish from Spain, Cubano, maybe Spanish from Cuba, Spanish from Mexico, Spanish from Colombia, Spanish from Chile. Those would all be different iterations of Spanish, very, very different, but also recognizable and distinguishable and appreciated, especially to a native speaker. But those are all the Romance. Those are all Spanish, which according to Tashrik Bey, Spanish itself is Moorish Latin. Spanish, to be more specific, is Moorish Latin. And so Spanish, actually, that might be a connotative statement. When you say Spanish, as a language, because Spanish is actually a people. The people of Spain are the Spanish people. The people of Spain likely spoke some iteration of Latin, likely them being part of Europe, the Iberian Peninsula, close to, but distinguishable, I think, at least in terms of historically, from Africa itself. How much of it was distinguished and is different than Africa may be arbitrary, because according to Tashrik Bey, all of Asia and Europe and Africa are one landmass, that being like Asia and Asia Minor. But ostensibly, Spain has a different history. Spain proper, that means like what's understood as generally Spain and agreed upon as Spain. Spain proper would be different than Africa proper. I'm not even saying that Africa is the real name of that landmass that's referred to as Africa, but Europe. I think Europe refers to Europa according to Tashrik Bey, and Spain, the Iberian Peninsula, if I'm not mistaken, would be different than Africa. It had been Spain, uh, likely using Latin. And a lot of those languages like English and French, they overlap a little bit, and then that might be a little bit different than like Germany. But I think Germany, like Prussia formerly, and some of those Slavic countries like the Czech Republic and stuff like that, and Slovakia, where my teacher's from, those would be yet different iterations of like European language, but they may be different than Latin in itself. I would imagine that English might be more to do with like Latin, English, French, then Spanish. Then you have like Germanic. Germanic, if I'm not mistaken, I'm guessing a little bit. I'm putting things together. That might be more like Norse leading, like Viking leaning, if I'm not mistaken. Then you have I don't know how Germany would compare to Eastern Europe, like Czech, but I know that the Czech Republic can be similar culturally, with Germany. But then as you go like to some of the Slavic countries, those languages, they're more reminiscent. It sounds similar to Russian, and they might be like part of that language family that would be different, I think, than Latin. But I bet you that Latin influence would be with that area of Europe. It's smaller geographically than a person could normally appreciate. I think without visiting there, like in visiting on trains, because each time I have known people that have visited Europe, they're surprised by how interchangeable and fluid you can go from one country to another quickly on the trains. But still, even dialects and regional speech mannerisms, they can still be very profound, but limited to small geographic swaths and cohorts, probably based on like restrictions of land, and then maybe social political restrictions about how people could roam about, travel about, but then also maybe intermarry and have dealings. But so if you listen to these languages, they're actually part of one another's history, and they're actually interchangeable so much as to be reminiscent of the Tower of Babel, and maybe being one language in the first place, that had been dispersed, but then also when being dispersed, re-collaborating and re-intermingling, such that especially countries that so but then the Moors contacted Spain, and benefited Spaniard people then to Europe with a lot of innovation, including not the least of which also language. I want to talk about a little bit, and plumbing. I want to talk about a little bit. What the hell does plumbing have to do with jack shit? Anything? Someone might ask, but I would beg to attempt to differ, to attempt to offer commentary on that, and what it had meaning to do with anything, including a library, including a car, including a city, including poverty, including affluence, including war. I want to talk about what the hell plumbing had jack shit to do with that in this one. But Spanish is actually Spanish. It might be a connotative construct in that that's actually a slang reference, a metaphor for you're saying when you say Spanish, you're saying the language that's employed by people from the country Spain and people who have been influenced by contact with the people of the country Spain, whether or not they inherit some of that original family bloodline of the Spaniard people, and or not, and to and not to people that would be Spanish speaking. Like some things are some things, right. So like the countries of Latin America and Spanish speaking countries have a very sophisticated, beautiful, but also diverse and sometimes very daunting history, as all people do, such that you can't exactly identify who in the Latin American countries and even in the diaspora who is Latin. So who is Spanish? So I think you would say Latin, the gente Latin. Who are Latin people? Is it people of African descent only, or not? Is it people of European descent, as in Spanish European descent only, or not? Is it people of native to the Americas, of native descent, or not? Is it any combination of those people, or not, or likely so? I think so. But then what would actually be the Latin people, gente Latin? The Latin people, like I like one thing I really like. I watched an interview by Jorge Masvidal, one of my favorite interviews of him. A couple years back, I think he was in Miami. He was getting ready to have a big fight in Miami, where he's from, and he was speaking to it. He took on a question in Spanish, and I began to. That's when I first really started to get into to crack a little bit of understanding Spanish. Where some of my exposure as a child, but then recently with the app Duolingo, it started to. I'm sorry, no, I don't think I had got onto Duolingo when I first heard that, but then I did got on Duolingo, and I would hear that interview of his. He was fielding a question in Spanish, and he said, "Adora mi gente Latin." That means I think that means that I adore my Latin people. But what would he, Jorge Masvidal, be referring to as mi gente Latin? Is it people of Spanish descent or not? Spanish descent only or not? African descent only or not? Descent native to the Americans only or not? Any specific or broad combination of those only or not? Or that to people with history of that or not? Or speaking the Spanish language or not? Or having experiences of living, dying, loving, suffering using Spanish language or not? Or histories of those people using the Spanish language or not? According to Dr. Claude Anderson, the like the way it's actually a little bit arbitrary how people rank off and form a concept, a self concept at all of like identity, but also how people organize for their own best interest in that of their family and the people that they love. And also that the people that they must cooperate and sometimes work against, which can amount to cooperation and or conflict and competition. But one of the ways that it's appreciated by Dr. Claude Anderson, like in Southern Florida, where Jorge Masvidal is from, you have a lot of success, a lot of beautiful presence of people from Latin America, all different parts of Latin America, probably Europe too, Spanish speaking too, but they also are well organized and savvy, like politically and economically, as to amount to a powerful, formidable political class constituency and viability and tractability in politics local to Florida, and then likely larger politics and beyond that. I can't speak to some of that, the sophistication of that, and how that would even break down. Like even this, I don't know actually how the state of Florida functions, is appreciated to function in an American election, whether within Florida or in like the presidential election. But I know that the Latin vote, and also the Latin organized the community of Latin people in Florida is very profound and savvy and effective, both for addressing their own economic realities and what's necessitated by them dealing with other people that would amount to and be demanded by being economically viable. And I can't speak to that and pass judgment on that, and even to call it good or bad. But I just know that it's very significant, the presence of Latin people in America at all, and that the Latin people benefit America greatly, and also probably receive benefit from America too, to different degrees, maybe sometimes greatly, as they would appreciate being here, or maybe not, but also I would imagine appreciate being here, and also making this place. But I'm saying is that what, according to Dr. Claude Anderson, would distinguish that community and would be a boundary, a threshold of that community, would be actually the Spanish language itself. Is that is a person fluent in Spanish, and so that would speak to either having experiences, loving, fearing, fighting, contributing, collaborating with people of the Latin history and story and experience and family. That would be meaningful. That a person would be familiar with the language enough to understand it and employ it in times of stress, love making, cooperation, work, enlightenment, study, and maybe even like shortcomings, stuff like that, to really make it, because the language is actually living. What I'm saying is the language is the people. That's why like you have channels like Navajo Elder Teachings, where it's very significant that he's uploading those, because it's been said that different cultures the world over, not the least of which different Native American people have lost some of the traction or the familiarity with their own customs and traditions and language, no less, is appreciated by sometimes elders. Like he said that statement, and my father would say that statement about some of the people that we come from in Africa, the Herero and Ovambo people, for my father. But so that these different languages, they can become in jeopardy, and just like a species can be in jeopardy, like endangered, so can too a language, and thereby also the people who are that language when they're doing at their best, because you may actually be at your best when you're using the language of your people, which are you. Not that you can't also learn other things, but that the Spanish language is very significant as a liminal threshold for Latin America, and like a little bit of a litmus test or shibboleth or unfalsifiable identifiable metric of who a person is in their background. But that too, when you're saying the word Spanish as a language, you're actually, so when you call all of people who speak Spanish Spanish speaking people, it's a little bit like kind of like slang, where that you're saying that they're Spanish speaking, but Spanish, that is the language and history of Spain itself, is not only and originally what is known as Spanish. I don't think, because it would be more so along the lines of Latin. I think because that's Europe, and they would be using Latin in that part of Europe. I think prior to contacting the Moors. I think, but then after contacting the Moors to give the Spanish language circa now what it would sound like in some of its sophistication and savviness and romance and character, which would also be part of its application and the experiences had within it, which are the people, which are it, is actually Moorish Latin. That is Latin antecedent to being contacted and influenced by the Moorish presence in Spain. I think it's accurate, it's congruent to say that the Moors contacted Spain. They had a lot to do with the history of Spain. There's probably still visible relics and vestibular prominences in Spain, and maybe art, and maybe still actually infrastructure that bears some of the history of the contact with the Moorish people in terms of both art, but also maybe function, that can't be easily wiped out, stamped out, or blighted. That contact, but then also the language too. It susses out and it bears the influence of the Moorish people, such as that which referred to as Spanish may be a connotative reference in metaphor and colloquial slang the world over. I don't know what actually colloquial expressions, idiomatic expressions, metaphor, our connotation is when it's that broad the world over, as to actually be a term, an actual connotative term, not an etymological term, but a connotative term that's actually coined and then actually redeemable and interchangeable as a terminology, that a viable terminology and coinage that's actually a little bit distinguished from what it refers to and what it is, but it's actually Moorish Latin according to Taj Street Bay. But that too, when you listen to, so the entire so when you're saying mi gente Latin, you may be saying mi gente they, so the Latin language. But actually, if you were to say mi gente Latin, you're actually also referring to English speaking and French speaking too, in the most strict sense because that's also Latin and inheriting the Latin language foundation. Like back in the day, what's actually the difference between a doctor and a layman back in the day and now? You can go on Google, you can read about anything, you can go to school for anything and get entitled about anything, whether that title is viable or not, sanctioned or not, or viable for being sanctioned the way it is or not. But actually, one of the actual things that distinguish a layman person from an actual professional, a believable medical professional practicing or not just believable, but also practicing, would be familiarity with Latin. Whether they studied Latin, the language, or they studied terminology. Like when I was saying carpals for the hands and tarsals for the feet, phalange, stuff like that, that would likely be Latin, I think. And but older strict Latin that didn't go some of the actual uh, 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 um, uh, improvisation and, for lack of a word, bastardization that has become the English language, coming antecedent to Latin, just because English borrows and appropriates a lot of other words from other languages as other languages do. But I think that the older Latin, it probably borrowed and appropriated less than more recent iterations of Latin, such as Moorish Latin, also known as Spanish, or Old English or Modern English. I don't mean Old English, but Modern Old English, Modern English, probably Modern French, Modern Old French would have been more appropriated and intermingled and amalgamated Latin than the Old Strict Latin. However, the Old Strict Latin was yet. It's interesting now. The Old Strict Latin was actually preserved and mitigated and concealed and preserved prior to antecedent. Prior to parallel to the development of the masses. That's interesting. So the masses that would use English, right? Like sometimes, like say I come on here, right, and I use a bunch of big words, whether in online or even at a library, right? I could be mocked, dismissed, ridiculed, ignored, fronted, denied, boycotted on any level, significant or petty. All that could happen if I were to use big words as they're not called for. What would make them call for? The reason that the big word wouldn't be called for me to use is because likely if I'm using a very big word also fluently and accurately, I'm actually using a more congruent form of etymology, likely that to an older iteration of etymology. The more and sooner you reach for a big word, a savvy. Actually, when people are saying, "Oh, you're using big words," oh, there's a big word. And sure, you don't trip over that word as you say it to me. When people are not respecting you for using a big word, what they're actually not respecting you to do is actually to use an old word. When you're using a big word, you're using an old word. However, you're using a word that's closer to the etymology of the foundation, which never ceased to be. The actual older etymology, that is the difference, probably the difference between a layman anything and a professional anything, a statured anything, a class anything, is the language, that too, where and how it'd be appropriated and how it'd be understood. So if you walk outside of your door, don't try this at home, man, but also don't try it away from home. If you're not if you're not using it the way it's intended as to be appreciated for using it, is that if you use a big word, you're likely actually using a stronger word because it refers to what you're referring to, and it's part of the human condition and experience that that word would correspond to what you're referring to, and that's in people's experience in their mind. In a person's mind is the experience of their ancestors and the people their ancestors were